Now I'd like to look a little bit at the Matthew 25 text, but make the connection to the focus that we have on dismantling structural racism. And this connects to the idea that we're talking about systems and groups of people and the ways that they interact collectively, based on the fact that Jesus is talking about dividing the nations at this point in the passage. And one of the things that personally makes me a little bit uncomfortable about some of Jesus' approach in the Gospel of Matthew is the way he's continually warning people of the punishment that awaits those who do not follow God's ways. We can see historically that motivating people through fear of punishment is quite an ancient strategy, so it's not surprising exactly to see it present in Jesus' parables and teachings, although I do notice the distinction in how Jesus uses it as an approach to try and get people to think about how they're living, and that maybe it's not quite in line with God's hopes and vision, rather than actively, preemptively trying to punish those who he decides are not interested in participating in the kingdom of heaven project that he's come to proclaim. We see that Jesus is telling a story like the punishment faced by the goats who will be cast away in the judgment of the nations, in order to get the people, the groups or societies that are acting like those goats, to wake up and repent and transform their way of living. Punishment is not the purpose in Jesus' activity in his life on earth. His purpose is to get people to think and reflect and change. So that's a really important distinction. Unfortunately, when we think about especially structures connected to the church, since that's who we are today and what brings us together for this Bible study, we can see historically that many rulers, governments, large populations of people who have claimed over the years to identify with the Christian message have carried out very public and dehumanizing punishments under the guise of doing justice. Therapist Resmaa Menakem says that this has created generational trauma, which continues to be passed down in the very nervous systems of our bodies, which then act out that trauma if we don't take on the task of healing it. The legacy of publicly sanctioned violence has lived in the DNA of white body supremacy since the days of public torture and executions in Europe. And in the United States, we can see the ripple effect of that legacy in the history of lynchings, which killed poor white people as well as a horrifying number of black people and other people of color in the U.S. territories. Of course, most recently, just this year and in recent history, we have so many examples that we could point to, including brown children placed in cages by the United States government. And photos of this atrocity have made the news for months and months, and yet for all the outrage and attempts at legal action, we so far have not managed to effectively put it to a stop and to right in any way the harm done. And meanwhile, we've continued to see upstanding, law-abiding citizens who work for that system continuing to just do their job, even though it traumatizes those young bodies and separates them from their families. In other parts of the world, we can also see this legacy of white body supremacy and its toxicity. It's certainly present in Latin America. Perhaps the most visible impact comes from the early days when the conquistadores came to this continent and violently took over the land, displacing, slaughtering, and forcibly converting indigenous communities to their faith. And then later, the Spanish Inquisition, which was famous for its brutal practices of torture, set up outposts up and down the Americas and enforced adherence to a strict version of Catholicism as a means of social control. In Cartagena, Colombia, people of African descent who'd been brought forcibly to the Americas in slavery were targeted by the Inquisition if they maintained any of their ancestral practices, which were considered to be potentially witchcraft. Jewish slave traders were also a popular target of the Inquisition in Cartagena, which is a major port city and received a lot of that slave trade traffic. And of course, they had the added benefit of having significant wealth to be seized by the church when they were called into question for their beliefs and practices. So we can see so many examples, and I'm highlighting some elements from the Latin American context which might not immediately come to mind for those in the US thinking about these issues, and part of the discussion of structural racism and white body supremacy. But I don't want to give the impression, of course, that the Catholic Church was bad and imply that Presbyterians are good, because numerous Presbyterian churches in the US and elsewhere certainly profited directly or indirectly from the human trafficking and enslavement of Black people in the 19th century. So I'm not trying to cover that up by not making it my focus. I just wanted to bring in a reference from a different part of the world. Continuing here in my reference point of Colombia, this past May, just 4 days before George Floyd's murder by police in Minneapolis, a 19-year-old Afro-Colombian young man named Anderson Arboleda died in Cali, Colombia, of head injuries sustained the night before. This was during the pandemic, and there was a curfew starting at 8 p.m., and police had found him sitting in front of his aunt's house with his girlfriend after that hour. And they were clearly coming to let them know they were misbehaving by being out on the street at that time. So Anderson was trying to get into the house, but before his aunt could open the door to let him inside, the police had struck him 3 times with a baton on the head. And these led to head injuries that he was taken to the hospital the next day, but unfortunately he died because of that. And the protests and outrage in the US following George Floyd's murder found an echo in countries around the world, including Colombia, where Anderson Arboleda's death quickly raised a public outcry. But of course, here in Colombia, as well as in the United States, and in so many places, even as some people demand justice, others defend the status quo and the value of law and order. And here, of course, I'm thinking particularly of those who, like me, live in white bodies. It's particularly easy for us to rely on that logic. Meanwhile, the specter of grotesque public violence, which is older than the cross on which Jesus died, continues to plague us today. So I'm left with the question, what are we doing about it? Those of us who are part of the PCUSA are part of a church with a legacy of harm to repair, with patterns of white supremacist culture that are part of our structures and ways of doing business within the church. And those of us who are U.S. citizens are part of a nation that is full of inequities at every level and which exports violence and injustice throughout the world via our official government foreign policy and military action and corporations with corrupt business practices and damaging the environment, etc., etc. So there are so many ways for us to reflect on this. And I guess the key thing, which is sometimes so easy for us to overlook because we tend to have such a individual focus, at least in our U.S. spirituality. When we see Jesus here in Matthew 25 talking about the nations, talking about societies, talking about collective groups of people, this forces us to shift our focus from that idea of individual piety or individual right action to considering a broader collective commitment to living with justice